Okay, hello students. Sorry we can't meet live today because of the weather. Better safe than sorry. I hope everybody is nice and warm at home. So I'm going to send this because we just simply don't have time to skip a week. We would end up missing some really exciting history. And so the history we're talking about today is very exciting stuff. Some of it might be a little familiar to you. You certainly will have heard of these people that we're going to talk about today. All right, so we had started this last week, the Reformation in England. Remember, the Reformation had started in Germany with Martin Luther, and then it eventually spread around to different places. At first, England was very opposed to it. Remember, Henry VIII actually wrote a big treatise about how, it was wrong until he wanted his divorce, and then he was suddenly a reformer, and he started the Church of England. So speaking of Henry, let's summarize his wives. Here they are. Remember, there were 6 of them, so we're going to see how the first one he divorced, that is Catherine of Aragon. She was the Princess of Spain. Keep in mind, she's the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. We'll get to Charles V today and then in successive weeks for sure. He's a very important person. Then came the beautiful and young and alluring Anne Boleyn. And when she failed to provide a son quickly for him, she was accused of all manner of cheating and terrible stuff and probably way overstated, but she was beheaded, right? Then comes the love of his life, Jane Seymour, who, after childbirth, giving birth to a son, the long-awaited Prince of Wales, died right afterwards. Okay, very sad. Then we have number 4. We see Anne of Cleves. She was the one that in a simple way of stating it, that Henry decided that she was too ugly. It's a little more complicated than that, but very interesting stuff. So he divorced her. Remember, she's the one who made out pretty well of all the wives because she ended up being put up in a lovely home with helpers, and she gave lovely parties. In fact, Henry consulted with her as like a confidant later in his life. Then came the trollop, Catherine Howard, who truly was cheating on her husband, and she was beheaded. And then his final wife survived. That's Catherine Parr, who was a delightful lady who ended up getting Henry to get back together with his 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. Okay, so she really healed the family things. He had taken care of his daughters. He just didn't want to be around them. They reminded him of his, failed marriages or whatever. And so, but she brought him back and they reconciled somewhat before Henry died. So then we looked at last week how Henry did pass away, and he left the throne to his little son. This is Edward VI. So the king is dead. God save the king. And here he is in all his regalia. Things started out well, but he was never a rigorous, strong young man. He always had some health issues his whole life. Now, Cranmer, this guy who had helped Henry to set the church up, the Church of England, was the main advisor to the young king. He was very sad about the death of Henry VIII, but he became the teacher for Edward, and he was devoted to his studies of Protestant thought. And he formed really what was to become the Church of England. He's really a great man. His processes of coming up with the different traditions in the English church were quite sound, very good. All right, so here we have Edward. He's still quite young at this point, but he is a very, very eligible bachelor. All of Europe is looking to see who will the young king marry. Now, previously, when he was younger, like a baby, he was promised and betrothed, actually, to his cousin, who was Mary. That's her to the right there. Her name is Mary. She'll become known as Mary, Queen of Scots. Not to be confused with his sister Mary. Okay, so there's 2 Marys here, and he had been betrothed very young to Mary, Queen of Scots. But the Scots had changed their mind midway and married her off to the Dauphin of France. So the Dauphin would be the crown prince of France. His name was Francis, and Mary would be shipped off to France as a young lady and then married to the king. She was briefly Queen of Queen of France. We will get to her story when we talk about France. So here we're talking about the Reformation, how it started in Germany. It's going to spread. We're looking at how it spread to England. And we will look what happened in France. It decidedly did not spread to France. The French definitely maintained their Catholic identity, and Mary was part of that. So Mary, Queen of Scots, was raised in Catholic France. So therefore, that had been broken off when Edward was very young. But he grew up with his sisters and his cousin. These were his most favorite people in the world. His sister Mary, who was quite a bit older than he, and she was also a devout Catholic. His sister Elizabeth, who was a little closer in age to him, one of his best friends, and she was kind of wavering between, whatever the way the wind blows, but she was solidly Church of England at the time of her brother's reign. And then his best friend of all is Lady Jane Grey. She's a cousin. We'll look at her lineage here in just a minute. And she was devoutly Protestant. Okay, I mean, very much so. A very brave stand on Protestantism, and you'll see that. So here we can kind of see the way the pictures are situated. We have our strong Catholic, our strong Protestant, and then the one in the middle. Okay, so Elizabeth, who is very smart about kind of playing the politics game here with the religion thing. Okay, so what did Edward do to change things up? So he made England Protestant for sure, and with the help of his advisors. Now we have down here Cranmer in the corner. This is Cranmer, who was a religious advisor, politically and somewhat religiously a little bit as well, is Edward Seymour. Now Edward Seymour was his uncle. That was his mother's brother. And he turned out to be quite a good advisor for the young king. So we can see these pictures over here. Here's Edward in the middle. We're going to see right here that he worked on, we'll look at these each in turn. He worked on getting the Bible in English put out. He got rid of the icons of Catholicism. He allowed priests to marry. We're going to see here they're speaking not in Latin, sometimes in English. And then we'll see how he's going to get rid of, essentially, the Catholic Church. Okay, so here we're going to look at them one by one. This to the right is his Book of Common Prayer that was written during this time. Cranmer had a lot to do with this. The Mass would no longer be in Latin. It would be in English, so that people could actually understand what the priests or pastors in this case were saying. The Book of Common Prayer was issued in English to everyone. You had to carry this book with you on Sunday to church. It was a law. You had to go to church. You couldn't skip. Okay, so that became sort of a theocracy, if you will, which, in America we don't abide by those kind of things. Priests could now marry. They're not going to be Catholic priests anymore. They're going to be, I'm not sure if they call them priests in the Episcopal or the Church of England setup. I'm not sure what they call them. Statues of the saints were removed from churches. In many cases, they were actually destroyed. Sometimes even entire abbeys and entire churches were destroyed, unfortunately, because they were beautiful pieces of architecture. Some of the ruins remain, in fact, and they're beautiful to go see. So some of this ended up in destruction, even sort of a wanton kind of a hate toward the Catholics at this point. Not by the king himself, but by those he sent out to go collect the gold and things that were in the churches. They basically confiscated any Catholic property for the king. Stone altars were removed and replaced with wooden communion tables. Okay, so for some reason they thought that this, the priest being up there, kind of separated from the people and saying the Mass for the Eucharist, which is the Lord's Supper, now they're going to make that Lord's Supper something that was more of a shared experience instead of just sort of a religious experience. It would be a shared thing that each individual went through. The stained glass windows were smashed. Yikes, that's too bad. The fancy implements, those would be the gold, plates and chalices and things like that, were sold off and possibly melted down for money. Catholic bishops who refused to join the Church of England were arrested and placed in the Tower. They were, by the way, given the opportunity to leave. And if they did not leave and stayed in this country and refused to stop preaching Mass, they would be arrested. Okay, and we're going to see how that's going to advance somewhat later, and some of them will actually end up being executed. All right, this is John Dudley, and he's the Duke of Northumberland. We're going to see he's going to play an interesting role here. He was convinced that the uncle, that would have been Seymour, had betrayed the young boy, that he was trying to take the kingdom for himself. We don't at this point historically believe that was true, but because of certain things set up by Dudley, there was evidence that was, I'm going to say, that was like a setup, right, to accuse Seymour, and Seymour ended up getting executed. He had been that uncle that was helping the king so much. So now Dudley's going to become the king's chief advisor. Okay, so he's a little bit of a shifty guy, and we're going to see we can't really trust him so much. It's kind of sad about Seymour here. All right, and this brings us to perhaps one of the most tragic stories of all history, certainly of English history, the story of Lady Jane Grey. Remember, this is Edward's cousin and his best friend. She was devoutly Protestant, and Edward was devoutly Protestant. They used to have long discussions about what exactly they believed and how the Bible was interpreted. Very deep young lady. She was very close to Edward in age, and they were both quite young. And so she is going to play a role that she never had seen coming for her. So Dudley, here he is on the right, had a young, handsome son, and he decided that he would get, his name is Guilford Dudley. He decided that he was kind of reading the tea leaves. In other words, he was trying to predict what was going to happen. He knew that the king was not a healthy person. He knew the king was young. He wasn't married. He had no children. And so he's looking to the future saying, what if the king doesn't make it? What's going to happen? Who could take over? And he saw this little glimmer of an idea. And so what he decided to do was to have his son, Guilford, married to the Lady Jane Grey. Okay, so Lady Jane had never met the guy. She thought she had heard stories because he was a little bit, had a reputation, if you will, as being sort of a rake. That would be somebody who was out with the partying, and certainly not a serious young man. He's quite young as well. So I'm going to say Jane was probably, 17, and this guy was probably 18, something like that. So did Dudley have a plan, and did he know something? All right. So like I said, he had suspicions about, the king's health. And then, the succession, that would be who would be the next king or queen. So he sees his son now marrying Edward's best friend and cousin, who does have an avenue to the throne. It's not super strong, but it is there. That's true. So here she finally gets her son to meet with Lady Jane Grey. I believe they actually formally met, maybe briefly before the wedding, but at the wedding itself. At first she was furious. She didn't like the guy. He was just this kind of foppish, shallow guy. But as time went on, she actually fell deeply in love with him. He was very handsome. And so she fell deeply in love with him. She made him a more serious person. She had him, read the Bible with her, and he started to see her point. And he said, oh, I hadn't thought of that. You're right. I think you're right about this whole Protestant thing. Now let's see how she fits into the story here. All right, so who we have here in the middle, this is Mary Tudor. This is Henry VIII's youngest sister. And when Henry was still the king, he had her married off to the King of France. That's him to the right. You actually know him. That is Charles the Duc d'Orléans. He's the one that had all those battles and wars in Italy. And ended up, taking over Florence for a short period of time just after Lorenzo de' Medici had died. And then he rushed back to France because his father had died, and he went to become the King of France. So by the time Mary, who was like I said, youngest sister, quite beautiful young lady, got married off to the king, he was an old man. And the plan here was for her to quickly get pregnant with the son, so there would be this new, king for France. Well, that didn't happen. He just didn't last long. I think he died maybe 6 months into the marriage or something like that. So Mary, of course, was not happy about marrying an old Frenchman. And so when he died, she said, wow, God has given me a second chance. And she contacted her, for the lack of a better term, high school sweetheart. It was a guy called Brandon, the Duke of Suffolk. they were deeply in love with each other, and they had actually approached the king previously to get married, and he said, no, of course not. She's the sister of a queen. She needs a much more advantageous marriage. And so he didn't allow it. And so after this king had died, and Mary had been the obedient sister, she felt justified in being able to marry her first love. Here he is. That's Brandon. And so they secretly got married. And it made Henry furious. He could not believe that Brandon was one of his best friends. Mary was his sister, and he felt absolutely betrayed. At first, what he did was he stripped both of them of all their property in England and forbade them from coming home. She had been in France, obviously, and they stayed there for a while until Henry cooled down and decided he wanted his best friend back and he wanted to forgive his sister. So he would eventually forgive them, but at first he was very angry with them. All right, so they're going to end up with a child who will have the child called Lady Jane Grey. All right, so you see Lady Jane Grey is going to end up in the succession order, and I'll give you a family tree here in a minute. Okay, so now we're going to look at Edward and what happened. So he was, like I said, ill, and when he was, oh look, he was only 15. Yeah, and so Lady Jane may have been only 16. She was 16 or 17, something like that. So he got very sick, and people thought he was going to die, but then he got well. Everybody said, yay. But then he got sick and died. Just died. Yeah. So most historians think that there was he had the disease called consumption or tuberculosis, which is a kind of insidious bacterial infection. We have antibiotics for it now, but it's a bacterial infection that sort of mimics or acts like a fungal infection. So it kind of grows slowly and creeps around, and then to use the medications that we have for it, they have to be taken, like, for instance, if you were diagnosed with tuberculosis and you were taking the antibiotics to kill it so you get better, the treatment would last a year or more. So, because it takes that long to kill that slow-moving bacterium. So we have a succession crisis now. Obviously, Edward does not have a son, and so who's going to become the king? So next in line officially would be his sister Mary. Okay, there's a problem with Mary. She's a Catholic. She's also a woman. All right, so some people didn't believe a woman was capable of taking over the throne at that point. The problem was there were no males in the line. There's nobody who could have done that. Okay, so let's take a look at the family tree. Here we have Henry the Seventh, right? Henry the Seventh and his wife Elizabeth of York. That's the, War of the Roses. Check out the Tudor rose right there. All right, then we see how, remember, Arthur was married to Catherine. Arthur died, so Henry was married to Catherine. Their daughter, Mary. Okay, divorced. Anne Boleyn gives him Elizabeth, beheaded. Jane Seymour gives him Edward. She died. Then we have the other wives there. Okay, meanwhile, Henry had a sister called Margaret, who had married James IV of Scotland, the king of Scotland, and they had a son called James V, who married Mary of Guise. By the way, Mary of Guise was a French woman who was, I believe, the sister or cousin of the King of France. And their daughter, aunt of the king, is Mary, Queen of Scots. So she marries Francis II of France, but we're going to find out in his story that he's going to die young. She'll come back to Scotland. We'll get to that later today in this lecture. Marries a guy called Darnley, and she has a son called James. All right, who was James VI of Scotland. James Stuart was his name. All right, then there was the other sister, Mary, the youngest sister. She was married to Louis of France, the old man, then married her love of her life, Brandon of Suffolk. And they had a daughter who married this man. They had Jane. So Jane was the granddaughter of Mary, so the grand niece of Henry VIII, right? So do you see where she fits in? Now, why do some people think that Mary does not qualify? One is because her mother had been divorced from the father, and therefore she had been, quote unquote, cut off from the family, Okay, sorry about that. They thought she'd been cut off from the family inheritance. Meanwhile, we have Elizabeth, who also, her mother had been, a traitor. But between the two, Mary was a devout Catholic and Elizabeth was a little bit, not as much a Catholic. And of course, we know Lady Jane is a very, very strong Protestant. And so everybody's looking at the options and they're thinking, well, probably, we don't want Mary. Elizabeth is a little bit of a question mark. And, Jane might be a really good choice here. So some people started kind of to manipulate things to make Jane the heir. And one of those people obviously was her father-in-law, right, Dudley. All right, so Jane was shocked when one day they come walking into her room to bring her the crown to say she's the Queen of England. Wow. Keep in mind, a queen had not run the country. The closest they got to it, remember, it was back with Matilda when she had that kind of long sort of civil war between her and King Stephen, but Stephen had ended up winning that anyway. So here comes young Jane. They present her the crown, and she absolutely refused it. She said, no, you're crazy. What are you thinking? What are you talking about? But then as her father-in-law spoke with her, as her husband spoke with her, they convinced her that it was the smartest thing to do to maintain the Protestant identity of this young church of this country that had just taken off, in this new direction. And so she accepted the crown. She signed the paper that said, yes, she was the queen, and she was the queen for 9 days. So let's see what happened to poor Jane. So Mary was not happy at all, obviously. She said, what are you thinking? I am obviously in the line. I'm first in the line, which she had, and you could see from the family tree, obviously, she had the strongest claim to the throne. She was the first daughter of the king. So Mary actually gathered an army, I'm guessing it was a Catholic army, to invade London. But it turned out when she got there, the people welcomed her with open arms. They also agreed that Mary was the strongest claimant to the throne, and they believed that, that she couldn't be too terrible, right? Yeah, they understood that she would probably maintain her Catholicism, but she's not going to go changing things. Just think about the people in the country. They have been kind of tossed to and fro here between, they started off strongly Catholic, supporting the Pope, and all of a sudden a no Pope, and then, we have this new church and all these rules, and so they're still somewhat confused. I'm sure there were plenty who were wanting to go back to the Catholic system, and so she was not opposed. Mary was not opposed. All right, so Lady Jane and her husband, Guilford Dudley, were put into the Tower, okay? So this was natural that they had to be arrested. Now, Mary, at this point in time, was inclined to forgive them. She knew Jane. Jane had grown up with her. I mean, she was quite a bit older, but it's not like she hated her with a passion or anything like that. They did completely disagree on religious matters, but I think there was a part of Mary that probably admired Jane's academic abilities, things like this. Okay, so she just put her in the Tower. They were treated well. Both of them, they were separated. They were not together in the Tower. They were in different cells. So they were certainly under arrest, but they were treated well. They had their books. They had their comforts. I think they were able to get visitors, things like this. It started off that way, at least. All right, so what did Mary do? First of all, she restored the country to Catholicism, which most people, weren't terribly surprised about that. But they wondered, how would she treat the Protestants? Would there be a forgiveness thing going on or what? So she restored the rule of the Pope. She brought back the Latin Mass. She reunited with Rome. And then she got married. And we're going to see who she marries here in just a minute. And there were some Protestants. Now, number 5 there, you see it says Protestants burned to death. Okay, it didn't start off that way. At first, she wanted, as long as people converted back to Catholicism, she was pretty tolerant at the very beginning. Okay, but there are a couple things that are going to happen to sort of mess up Mary's head. I'm talking about, her mental thinking here. First of all, the marriage took place. She married a very young and handsome prince. Look at him there, so cute. He is Philip II of Spain. Now, Philip is the son of Charles V. He's the one we met previously. He's the Habsburg chin guy, right, who had the very pronounced chin. So Philip also has a pronounced chin. You can't see it as well here because they did figure out growing a beard sort of hid that somewhat. And he was very, very, very Catholic. Okay, so Philip sees the opportunity to unite Spain and England as a giant Catholic kingdom. And Mary was delighted to have this dashing suitor. He would have been related to her in some weird way, right? Her mother was Charles's aunt, so that would mean that this was her second cousin once removed or something like that, but which was quite normal back in the day. Now, I will say that Philip, he was a little younger than she was, and he was very excited about this important marriage, but he wasn't all that excited about his wife. He was going to be a good husband and this kind of thing, but he wasn't. He wasn't fawning over her, and so she was a little disappointed in that. All right, so kind of a little trouble in England with the people who had really appreciated the Protestant change. Now all of a sudden it's just gone. It just evaporated overnight with Mary coming in. So we're going to see several rebellions take place among the Protestants. But the most important of these was the one led by this young man named Thomas Wyatt, called Wyatt's Rebellion. It was, one of the more, I'm going to say, quote unquote, successful ones, although they didn't succeed. They certainly made a splash of things. So we're going to see here a group, almost an army, essentially, storming the castle in London. Okay, so while it was a clearly Protestant rebellion that was taking place, one of the biggest fears they had was Philip, the king of Spain. And it started off with sort of an idea about when Philip came to meet and marry Mary, that they might try to kidnap him or hold him for ransom, something weird like that. Anyway, they had all these ideas, and their big plan was, of course, to bring in lots and lots of people to support them, so they would be like overwhelming numbers. There were several conspirators in this, different names. I'm sure the English children have to know all these names and things. We don't need to. But one of them, unfortunately, was the father of Lady Jane Grey. He wasn't a big planner of anything. He was just a supporter of what was going on. It's actually quite a fascinating tale. If we had enough time, we would go through the fact that these conspirators ended up being captured, and they were hiding in places like an old tree, and a guy was hiding under some hay, and they all got found out, including Thomas Wyatt. All right, so these rebellions, Wyatt's being one of them, made Mary very paranoid. Okay, you can't blame her, really. There were talks about people wanting to kill her and people wanting to kidnap her, and obviously kidnap her husband. So she became very intolerant of all Protestant movements. She thought all of them were schemes to take her crown away. They were all scheming against the true universal church of God, so they were scheming against God, basically. So this is when she began this Protestant persecution. She really had no tolerance anymore of any Protestantism. Just going to Catholic Mass wasn't enough anymore. You had to truly prove that you were a Catholic. This is where she gets the nickname, the moniker Bloody Mary, because there will be they will seek out, they will arrest, and they will execute Protestants at this point. Now, Jane had nothing to do with this rebellion. Remember, she was in the Tower, but her father had been implicated, and they had used her as their champion to pursue this route. Now, so they said, in the name of Lady Jane, remember Jane, this kind of thing. They had their original plan, though, was to get Mary out and put Elizabeth in. That was the plan of Wyatt's rebellion, at least. I'm sure others wanted to get Jane back on the throne. But because of this problem, Mary was really forced, her hand was really forced to deal with Lady Jane, leading to what I said is one of the most tragic figures in history. So here she is, Lady Jane. Her fate is sealed. She has been now accused of treason, and she will be executed. Because she's a royal, she's part of the family, she will get to have, get to be beheaded instead of any kind of torture. So that was something. Remember, she's still a young lady. I think she's 19 or 20 at this point, very, very young. And so she is told of her fate, and she was taken from her cell into the courtyard of the Tower where the execution would take place. This is like a romanticized view of, here's, lovely, innocent, wonderful Jane. I will say she was pretty much innocent. She was used as a pawn by her father-in-law, even her father to some extent. But really, she was she was caught up in this fight between Protestantism and Catholic, and she was just an unfortunate, victim of what was going to happen here. So the way the story goes is that they brought her in, and she's blindfolded. That's typical, so you don't see the execution or things like this. And this is showing how she's reaching toward the block where she's supposed to place her head, and she was very concerned that she couldn't find it. So she's reaching out. She's kind of blind because of blindfold. She's reaching out and she can't find it, and she starts to panic just a little bit, saying, "Where is it? Where is it?" And this man behind her helps her by leading her hand down to touch it so she knows where it is. It was kind of a touching moment here. We have the executioner waiting there for this. Okay, real quickly before we move on here, she was executed just prior to her death. Whether it was hours before or maybe perhaps the day before, her husband also was beheaded, and she was told that her husband was dead. And so at that point she said, well then, I just would rather go to heaven and be with my husband and be with my Lord. And so she was resigned and otherwise fairly calm and peaceful about her death. But such a tragic story. She might be a good subject for when y'all are going to have to do your biography. She might be a good one to check into. All right. There were other people who were part of the Protestant movement in England, and these were people who decided not to convert back to Catholicism. So they made a stand. They are going to refuse to become Catholics, and they will continue to have Protestant services, which now is against the law. So we have Hugh Latimer here on the right and Nicholas Ridley on the left. We're going to actually watch a little video about these guys.
Was discovered by Columbus in 1492. Two men were born on this side of the Atlantic who would have a powerful impact on the shaping of Protestantism in Britain, Latimer and Cranmer. Hugh Latimer was born in 1491 here in the small village of Thurcaston, just north of Leicester, a similar area that John Wycliffe would have worked just over a century before. His father was a farmer, and yet despite their humble occupation, he made sure that Latimer stayed in school and got an education, a vital decision that would take him far in life. He enrolled in Cambridge University at the age of 14, and in 1510 was elected a fellow here at Clare College. He was at the time an ardent papist and preached passionately against men such as Luther and Melanchthon for 7 years. His belief in Catholic teachings was great, and his zeal in the divine mission of the papacy was unshakable. So what turned this pillar of papism into a pillar of Protestantism? An encounter with a man by the name of Thomas Bilney, who afterwards would visit him, even coming to the confessional booth to speak with him, and he eventually changed his views. The two men would later go and visit the sick and imprisoned in Cambridge together. Latimer went on to become the royal chaplain and the bishop here in Worcester, advocating for papal reform and denouncing the clergy who did not own a Bible, or the parishioners who could not even recite the Lord's Prayer. His clarion call to reform ended him in prison in 1539, but he was spared the stake by the intervention of Thomas Cromwell. He remained in prison until the death of Henry VIII, when Edward VI released him from prison. He would never ever hold the high office of bishop again, but continued to preach regularly, where audiences enjoyed his preaching, which was known for its wit, its intelligence, and its biblical nature. When Edward VI died on July the 6th, 1553, England was thrown into turmoil. Lady Jane Grey ascended the throne, but only had it for 9 days before Mary Tudor took the throne. Despite initial favor toward the reformers, her intentions of making England a Catholic nation soon became clear. Mary ordered the arrest of Latimer, and word reached him that his captors were on their way, offering him an opportunity to escape, but he chose not to. As he passed Smithfield on his way to London, he commented, "This place has long groaned for my life." Imprisoned here at the Tower of London, he met Nicholas Ridley, Bishop of London, and Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury. In March of 1554, they were tried here in Oxford, where Latimer was asked whether the natural body of Christ was in the sacrament, to which he responded, "Our Saviour's body is in heaven, whither he departed at the Ascension." He went on to explain that the change at communion was not in the bread, but in the heart of the believer. He and Ridley were sentenced to death, and on the 16th of October, they were brought to the place of their execution outside Balliol College. Here, a cross marks the ground of the exact spot where they were burned to death. Before the flames, they shared an embrace, and Ridley said to Latimer, "Be of good cheer, brother. God will either assuage the fury of the flames or strengthen us to endure it." Latimer then responded, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day, by God's grace, light a candle in England, as I trust in God shall never be put out." History says that Latimer died soon after, but Ridley died a slow and painful death. The cost of their death was just over £1.05, but the real result was the overthrow of Romanism here in England. The entire country was appalled by a religion that had to resort to such brutal methods in order to sustain itself. As we contemplate their life and their death, the real question for us, though, is, does the light that they lit at their death still burn in our lives and our witness today?
All right, so you see there that they became martyrs. So here they are on the fire pile. Notice they didn't get the, deference that Lady Jane got, because they're not, royal. They're burned in the street, essentially, not in the castle, no beheading, this kind of thing. This is, I think, a contemporary drawing at the time of them saying their last words. There are Latimer and Ridley dying of basically heresy on the flame. So that brings us to Cranmer. Remember him. So the three of them were in the tower together. They had agreed with one another. And we're going to see that all three of them had been given the opportunity to accept Catholicism. And, of course, Ridley and Latimer rejected that. Cranmer, however, actually did it. Okay, so he did renounce his Protestantism and became a Catholic. And then Mary decided she wanted him dead anyway. Now, you have to understand that she despised Cranmer. The reason is he's the one who arranged the divorce of her mother to Henry. All right, way back then. And she just despised him her whole life. She thought he was a bad guy. And so here he was. He had done what she asked him to do, which was to renounce his Protestantism, become a Catholic again, and she still sentenced him to execution. All right, so at that point, Cranmer renounced his renunciation, and he said, "I didn't mean it. I'm not really a Catholic. I am a good Protestant." And as he was being put on the fire to burn for heresy, he stretched out his arm and he put his hand, and he said, "I would like my unworthy right hand to be the first thing that burns." The reason is it was that hand that he used to sign the confession that he was no longer a Protestant. And he said that was the biggest regret of his life, and now he wanted his hand to burn first, and he held it over the flame. And then he was obviously, consumed by the, noxious fumes and things, and was killed and martyred for the cause. So we call them the Oxford Martyrs. So we have Ridley, Cranmer, and Latimer here, and these guys would be held up by later people to proclaim the brutality of Mary's reign, and that's where she got the name Bloody Mary. And so probably we're going to be looking at this, purging, if you will, and we're going to see a guy called John Fox. Here he is on the right, and he started writing about each one of these people who were killed in this spree by Mary, and it's called Fox's Book of Martyrs. of suffering and death of the Protestants under Queen Mary. And so he wrote down specifically different tortures that were done. Here's a guy, being stretched on a deal until he confesses he's no longer a Protestant, that kind of thing. So John Foxe wrote about these things. And later what he did is he expanded his book to include any of the martyrs from even the previous years, even the time of right after the time of the book of Acts, so way back. So all these people we've learned about who were the saints who had been martyred, they were all written down by John Foxe in his book of martyrs. And he says at this point the Protestants have kind of taken on the true church, therefore they're the martyrs. By the way, there are still martyrs being added to this list today. So Foxe's book of martyrs is still in publication, and people who die for the cause of Christ around the world are still being added to it. Okay, now what was going on with Elizabeth all this time, right? Remember, she was sort of in the middle there. She understood Jane's position. She understood Mary's position, her sister and her cousin. And she was at first implicated in Wyatt's rebellion. The reason she was implicated is because they said, we want to take Mary out and put Elizabeth in. All right, she had not agreed to it. It wasn't like she had been part of their meetings or anything like that. And so at this point, Mary had a tough decision, because while Jane had shown to want to take the crown because she had, then that was the justification for putting her to death. Elizabeth had never shown that. Elizabeth had always been loyal to her sister. She never tried to usurp anything. And so at this point, Mary couldn't just get rid of her. It's her actual sister, whereas Jane was a cousin. And so what they decided to do with Elizabeth at this point was just to put her under house arrest in a lovely place. Oh, I went the wrong way, sorry. A place called, what's the name of it? The Hatfield House, north of London. Here's the house. It's lovely. Look at the beautiful gardens. And Elizabeth spent her time in study and reading, and she was very well educated. She wasn't as religious, quote unquote, as Jane had been, but she certainly was studious. And she loved reading, the great pieces of literature. And we're going to see when she becomes queen that the literature of the country will just blossom under her, because she really appreciated that kind of thing. So she lived, maybe a little bit of a nervous life. She was a little concerned if her sister was going to ever turn on her. So she just kind of kept a low profile and just was very obedient, did whatever her sister asked her to do. All right, so here is Philip. He does finally come to see his wife. Remember when he came, they were talking about the kidnapping plot and stuff like this. Well, now it's safe for him to come and visit with his wife. And so she was head over heels, goo goo gaga in love with him. And he was just like, yeah, you're my wife, you're the queen. I would like to be king of England. He wanted to be king. He had very ambitious plans that way. Let's talk about what happened. She was desperate, of course, to have a child. Obviously, she wanted to have a son with Philip, and that son could be the next king of England. And there were several what they call phantom pregnancies, where she thought she was pregnant, and the last one was very convincing, because her belly got really big and swelled up and all this kind of stuff, and she was sure that this was the baby she had waited for. But in truth, very sadly, it was actually a tumor that was growing in her abdomen. It was probably ovarian cancer. And she ended up dying from that. Okay, well, here she was so excited to think that she was pregnant and having a baby, and then come to realize she was dying. And so that was, obviously the end of Mary. And so now where are we? Who's left? Okay, the only one left is obviously her half-sister, Elizabeth. All right, so Elizabeth knew her sister was ill, knew that things were going badly. And the day that her sister died, they came to her house at Hatfield, and they said, the queen is dead, long live the queen, and handed her the crown. And she quoted Psalm 118 saying, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." And she would become now Queen Elizabeth I. Okay, so she's not the first queen of England, because that would be technically Lady Jane, although she was never coronated. So then Mary, who was indeed coronated, and now there's going to be a massive coronation for Elizabeth, which of course vaults her immediately into the #1 most eligible bachelorette in the world. And here she is fairly young. I will tell you a few things about her childhood. She survived a bout with smallpox. I mean, smallpox was killing people all over the place, right? Well, she survived it. She did have some pox marks on her face, which made her very self conscious her whole life. She was always very concerned that she wasn't beautiful. And I don't know if you can say she wasn't beautiful. She thought that she wasn't as beautiful, namely as her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, who, by the way, does have a claim to the throne. So we're going to see how that shapes up here in just a minute. So here she is. I believe this is her regalia for her coronation that she's wearing right here, a famous painting done of Elizabeth. So what is she going to do? All right, remember, she was never really strongly Catholic, never really strongly Protestant. How is she going to handle the problem? Remember, England had been thrown back into Catholicism at this point under Mary. Okay, so now she's going to have a compromise known as the middle way. All right, she would call herself not the head of the church, but the supreme governor of the church. She allowed some of the, what would we call that, ceremonial parts of the Catholic service to be maintained. People really kind of missed that ceremony part of it. And if you've ever been to a Catholic service, the ceremony is very beautiful. You know, the beautiful songs and some of the readings and things like this. She did continue to allow Latin to be spoken and have the Latin prayer book, but she reinstituted that English one as well, the one that her brother had put in, the common book of prayer. There were changes to the communion service that made it sort of in the middle, right? So the priest was still in charge of it, but the people still participated in it. Okay. It allowed for bishops, priests, ornaments being the traditional things of Catholicism, the more ceremonial things. Yet Catholic priests who had Catholic services, Mass, the old way, the Catholic way, they were threatened with arrest. They were also offered the ability to leave the country. Some of them did, some of them didn't. And some of them were persecuted and arrested by Elizabeth if they did not conform. Okay, so you can see over here to the left all the different kind of things. The Bible, of course, is in, you can see it's in English and Latin right here. The prayer, I think this is supposed to represent the prayer book, was once again required that all people would carry that with them to church every Sunday. They did have that. Well, that law was still in place. That had really never changed. Now, she was officially excommunicated by the Pope in 1570. I think that didn't bother her one little whit. She was maybe proud of that, in fact, like her father had been. All right, some of the Catholics who refused to stop preaching would be arrested, and here's one of them. His name is Edmund Campion, and he actually had come to England, I believe from France, in order to preach Catholicism. In other words, he willingly took on this treacherous cause of breaking the law in England. He wanted to do that. So he came in, and he had been warned and was arrested and given the opportunities to leave, but he just refused to do it. And so he was eventually tortured and looks like hanged here for his breaking that law right there in England. So he's one of the, I think he became maybe a saint afterwards. I'm not exactly sure about that. But he's one of the more famous people who suffered under this. But remember, it was essentially his choice. All right, let's see what was happening in Scotland. I told you about Mary. Here's Mary, Queen of Scots. Remember, not Bloody Mary, but Mary, Queen of Scots. She had been the Queen of France for a brief time until her husband, the Dauphin, Francis, had died. Now, we'll get to him when we talk about France, because we're going to go back in time a little bit to see what was going on in France. Solidly Catholic. Francis probably died of an abscess of his tooth that infected his brain, essentially. Very painful, awful. So she went back to Scotland. She was shooed off. The people in France didn't want her anymore. And when she got back to Scotland, things had changed pretty significantly. And you can imagine what I'm talking about as far as change. Religious change. Okay, so there had been the Reformation in Scotland. When England pulled away from the church, Scotland had its own ideas. So we have a Scottish Reformation, and it revolves around this man here. His name is John Knox. He's really quite a hero, honestly, of Christendom, if you ask me. He placed these reforms in Scotland that were significant. They're still being felt today. He actually had a massive influence on on the religion in America, actually. So if you have known anybody who's a Presbyterian, they would be someone who considered themselves Reformed out of the Knox tradition. So he held the Calvinist model. Remember, John Calvin was the Frenchman. Now we've briefly talked about him when it comes to Reformation. Remember, we talked about the 5 points of Calvinism and things like that. We're going to see Calvin was French, and so we're going to see when we talk about the French Reformation, which was essentially non-existent, how Calvin was treated and all that. Okay, so we'll get to that. So Knox had his own book of prayer. I will say he was very strict, maybe so far as to say maybe a legalist. But we'll see. I want you to know I have a huge amount of respect for Mr. Knox. Okay, so when Mary came back, he wanted to have an audience with her to convince her about the truth of the gospel. And so he presents it to her in his Protestant way, and she says, no, thank you. I really like my Catholicism. So they reached a compromise. She would continue to celebrate Mass privately, okay? But she would not interfere with the Protestant movement in Scotland, the Scottish Church. She would leave it alone. It would be like a separate deal. She is the Queen of the Scots, and she is in charge politically, but their religion thing would be separate. Okay, so let's talk about Mary's life here. It's quite an adventure. So when she got back to Scotland, she fell in love with this young rogue named Darnley. And he saw the Queen of Scotland, and he said, oh, I've got, I can get some power here. And so she actually kind of, on a whim almost, married the guy. And the people of Scotland they thought that was crazy. They had a baby. His name was Sweet Baby James. Here he is. I know he looks like his clothing is a little bit foppish there. This is a little later in his life. Just rest assured that is a boy. And after some time went by, Darnley was not a good guy. He was not very interested in his wife. He wanted, of course, to be considered, quote unquote, the king, although I don't think he was ever called that. He neglected her, and she turned her attention to this musician called David Riccio. And Riccio was just this kind of, I believe he was an Italian, played the music and very dashing. And Mary, fell in love with him, and she used to invite him over for parties and things like this. And people began to know about it, and it created a scandal. So we're going to see Mary's life as, just rife with scandal. All right, so Mary's husband, Darnley, was very upset with this. So he and his friends planned a little visit to Riccio. These Protestant nobles entered the Queen's chamber during one of the parties, and they attacked Riccio. Look, Mary's there. She apparently saw it happen. I'm not sure if that part's true. They stabbed him 56 times, and yeah, he died. So everybody knew about it. It was a scandal. Yikes. Okay. Also, Mary's heartbroken. And then something weird happened. Darnley exploded. Literally. His castle where he was staying had some sort of mysterious explosion, and he was killed. All right? Weird. So it's kind of an interesting story. When it blew up, they found Darnley dead in his bed several, yards away from the, but he was like the bed had been blown out of the castle and landed on the ground with him in it, and he's dead. Okay, so very strange. And of course, people are suspicious, and it is a scandal. But now Mary is, single again. How about that? So we find other things about her. So something was revealed. There's her husband right there, who, of course, blowed up, right? And they found this cache of letters that had been written to Mary from an admirer called James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell. And they suspected that Bothwell had done the exploding, right? That maybe he got rid of this guy because he wanted to marry Mary. And that was the conspiracy theory going on there. But after Darnley exploded and after he was dead, guess what happened? Mary married this Bothwell guy. There he is. Okay, so she married him. Oh my goodness, the people of Scotland said, well, maybe it's true. Maybe he did kill Darnley. It was a scandal. Yikes. Well, all of this was just too much. The Protestant leadership, John Knox, he was just horrified by this whole thing. We had this wanton woman, this murderess, this, she's just horrible, right? So they came to her and they said, look, you have lost the will of the people here. They are against you on this. There's just too many things weighing on you. So she did indeed sign the paper that abdicated the throne in favor of her son James. All right, so then she was put under house arrest. They said they would treat her well, but they didn't want her coming back for the crown. And so young James, of course, was put into the care of the Protestant leadership, including Knox himself. I don't know that he personally did anything, but he would be in charge of the boys' upbringing. All right. So we can see the changes that were made here. So this kind of evolved over time using John Knox's model. And they came up with what was known as the constitutional monarchy. So James, as the king, is under the law. He is a bona fide Protestant Scottish reformer, right? So he would be considered Presbyterian, is the way they call it there in Scotland. And here's the confession of faith right here, and the king was brought up that way. And I think probably we could say that James was, a true believer because he was brought up that way since he was a child. There's some symbols over here to the right that represent that Scottish church. Now, Mary had been under house arrest, been treated, fairly well, but she was unhappy. So she participated in a plot to get her escaped, which happened. She was taken to safety out of the house arrest. Essentially, she was under. Here, the guys rescuing her, taking her off to England, where her cousin Elizabeth Shirley would be her best friend to help her. All right, so here, back in England, we have Elizabeth. So here's Elizabeth. She's securely into her reign as the queen. She is a very capable young woman, strong of, she was kind of taller for the women of the time, maybe about my height, 5'7" or so. And she had a strong constitution. What I mean by that is that, like for instance, she had survived the smallpox deal, right? So she must have a pretty decent immune system, and she was just a strong person all around. And like I said previously, she was the most eligible bachelorette in all of Europe. So who will she marry? And there's a question, of course, here. If she marries a man like Mary, her sister had married Philip, and it never got to the point where Philip was considered the king of England. Would Elizabeth's husband be considered a king? How would that work out? Nobody could quite understand. It was kind of an unprecedented new place to be here. So here's one of the people that was vying for her hand, and his name is, what is her name? Robert. This is Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. I believe he's related to the Dudleys, the ones that were, involved in the Jane Grey situation. Now, I will tell you that Elizabeth really appreciated handsome men, and he was considered very handsome, and so he was one of the people. But he wasn't royal. He was a landowner, and he was part of the upper classes, but he wasn't a prince or anything. So the idea really is that the Queen of England should marry a prince or from another country, make some sort of advantageous political alignment there. But she had a crush, if you will, on Dudley here. So we'll call him Leicester because it gets confusing because of all the Dudleys. So he's the Earl of Leicester. So who is she going to marry? Well, she can't really marry him. He's not really high enough up. And so there is her previous brother-in-law, Philip. How about that? So Philip says, hey, I think I'm next in line to marry you. I was married to your sister and she died. So how about marrying me? Well, she didn't like Philip. Here he is. You can see his prominent chin there. Remember, he's the son of Charles V of the Habsburg dynasty. And so she refused that almost out of hand easily. At one point, some people even argue that she may have been engaged to a prince of France, and she was enamored with him. He was cute. He came over and charmed her and this kind of thing. She was kind of easily charmed by men, but yet never did she take any of them to be her husband. She didn't marry anyone, ever. Okay, so she never got married. She, at one point, decided that she would just be queen on her own. She didn't need a man, and they would worry about succession later. Okay, so she had several people whom she called favorites. Dudley over here, Leicester, would be one of those favorites that she enjoyed having around her a lot. So in other words, she would have dinner parties and things like this and invite these men who would just lavish her with praise, and she really appreciated that. All right, so here we have kind of a split between Mary Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth, her cousin. All right. The big split essentially is that Mary is a devout Catholic and Elizabeth is a devout Protestant. Remember, Mary had escaped Scotland to come to safety in her sister's England, her cousin's England. And interestingly, Elizabeth allowed her into the country, but then put her under house arrest up in northern part of England. Okay, so we're going to see things here. There's a place called Tutbury Castle. These are the ruins of it. And she had her cousin put under house arrest. It shows her here behind bars, which is a little dramatic. She was well cared for. But something you may not know that you might find interesting is Mary, Queen of Scots, and Elizabeth, her cousin, never met each other ever in their whole lives. Even when they were children, they never met. So I think there's a movie that came out recently called, Mary and Elizabeth or something like that. Fairly, very current movie. And I haven't seen it. I guess I should watch it to figure it out. I don't know if they suggest that they had met with one another, because the truth is they never did. All right, so here is Mary being treated well, but not being treated like a queen of a country, right? So she's a little bit upset about this, that her cousin's not treating her better. So there are plots. Plots abound. And guess who's plotting? Catholics. Catholics are plotting for Mary to take over the throne of England, and then after that they can work on getting back the throne of Scotland. So Scotland's up there with Knox doing his thing. England's down with the Church of England, and we have a couple of conspirators here. On the left we have a guy called Anthony Babington, and in the middle a guy called Francis Throckmorton. They're really only famous because they were caught plotting with Mary. Once again, they show her kind of in jail over here. She was under house arrest, but being treated fairly well. So they found that Mary had written several letters to these guys, and these guys had indeed formed some plots to overtake the throne of England. Now this is Elizabeth's advisor on political intrigue. He's called the Spy Master. His name is Sir Francis Walsingham, and he is the one who was finding all this stuff out. He developed so many techniques for finding out what was going on behind the scenes. It's really quite fascinating, his spy network. It gets very cloak and dagger and this kind of thing. Another good option for a biography study right here on this guy. He uncovered the plots of Throckmorton and Babington, and in the some of the letters that were written, actually the return. So they would put a letter like in a barrel that was supposed to have beer in it, which was what Mary was drinking, because the water was not very safe. And they were she would get the barrel and she would empty it and then find the letter and read some stuff about this. I mean, so very very spy-like. And one of the letters she had written back, there was at least a few implications that she indeed wanted to take the throne away from her cousin, which is treason, of course. So Walsingham brings that evidence to Elizabeth and shows it to her and says, it's very clear that your cousin is indeed involved in a plot to take the throne. We must deal with this. She must be tried for treason, which she was, in the northern part of England there. And you can see she was convicted. We're at the executioner place here. You can see the guy with the axe there in the front, ready to cut her head off. Okay, so at this point, she's being read. Here she is. She was wearing this we're going to talk about her dress here in just a minute. She's being read the death sentence that she's been given by her cousin Elizabeth. So it took a long time for Elizabeth to do it, to actually write the death warrant for her cousin. Most people believe that Elizabeth, felt a little guilty about sending her cousin to heaven. So here we see that it's being read to her. She took it very stoically. And then when it came time for the execution day, she had this like long black kind of cloak on, a sort of an outside dress, if you will. And when she came to the actual execution block, she took the cloak off, and underneath she was wearing a red dress. And the red dress was kind of symbolizing her Catholicism in some way. All right, so we're going to see here another stylized view of her execution day. Here she's having her eyes covered, and we're going to see how the executioner is going to cut her head off. Now, this turned out kind of notorious, I guess you could say. She's not in London. She's in northern England here. and she is stoically taking this death sentence pretty well. And she laid her head down, and as the executioner came, he brought the axe down on her neck, but he missed. Oh, he kind of hit the back of her head a little bit, and then he had to bring another blow down to take her at her neck, and then it didn't cut all the way through. There's a possibility somebody paid him to use a dull axe. Oh, just awful stuff. And then he picked up her head once it was severed to show everybody that she was dead, and as he did it, he didn't realize she was wearing a wig. And so he picked it up, and the head came bouncing out. I kid you not. And he's holding onto this beautiful red, wig, and underneath her hair was short and gray. So she had been kind of faking the whole beautiful red hair situation for some time. Oh my goodness, so notorious. All right, so during the Elizabethan time, we're going to cover Elizabeth more next week as well. There's just so much. She did rule for a very, very long time. And one of the gains she did was, of course, sending explorers to the New World. Where the Spanish and the Portuguese had sort of cornered that market of the New World, they mostly had stayed down in that southern area. Okay, so down in South America, Central America, Mexico. And so we're going to see Elizabethan and the English are going to explore farther to the north, Canada and what is now the United States of America. So let's see some of these guys. This guy is very, very famous. He's called Sir Francis Drake. He was one of her favorites. Remember, she enjoyed handsome men hanging around with her, and he was one of them. And when they were favorites of her, they could ask for favors, and one of the things would be, of course, could he have a ship that he could go do some exploring? So their big rival, of course, would have been Spain, and Philip of Spain. Philip was the king of Spain at this point. His father, Charles, was the Holy Roman Emperor, and he had given the throne of Spain to his son. We'll get to that in a future day. So the famous ship of Francis Drake is called the Golden Hind, and so Elizabeth would send these guys out for exploration, looking for any kind of interesting materials, gold, riches, things like this. And Drake is going to be the first Englishman to circumnavigate the world. That means he's going to go all the way around. You can see he started here. It should actually be starting up in England, comes down around through the Straits of Magellan, up the west coast of the Americas, and then around over to here and through the islands below Africa and back to England. He made it all the way, unlike Magellan, right? And of course, he was a hero. Other explorers, we're gonna come back to Drake, by the way. Other explorers include Martin Frobisher. He ended up over in very high up in Canada. Notice he named something after himself, Frobisher Bay, and we're going to see he had looks like 3 different forays into the New World, and he would have reported things back to Elizabeth. For the most part, they were looking for something, the elusive Northwest Passage, trying to get through. Everybody's still very interested in getting to China and getting to India for the spices and things like this. And they're really, at this point, almost looking at North America like a blockade to that. They're trying to get through it so they can get back over to Spain and India. They're going to find out that North America was much larger than they had anticipated. Here's William Baffin also looking for this Northwest Passage. Keep in mind, up here to the north, as you can imagine, even in the summertime, it's very cold up in here. And for the most part, this area that goes through, it's going to keep going, if we could keep going, is frozen to this day. Is there a Northwest Passage? Technically, I guess you could say there is, but practically, no. There's no way to get through the top of Canada. It's way too big and mostly frozen all the time. But doesn't mean they weren't trying to. They weren't trying to still find it. So we can see we're there. Did we look at? Yeah, here's Baffin Island named after it, and Baffin Bay. These are named after William Baffin, sent out by the Queen. Humphrey Gilbert also ended up over in the areas known as Canada, right? So Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. If you remember Nova Scotia, in American history, we learned how the British, that's called New Scotland, and they had taken that away from the French. Once again, we'll get to the French in a later day. Interestingly, as a way home, notice his little line ends here at the Azores. Something happened right here. There was a big storm, and Humphrey Gilbert's ship was shipwrecked, and he never made it back to England. So kind of mysterious. He obviously died in maybe the shipwreck, something like this. We're not exactly sure. But he had a young nephew, or maybe it was a half-brother, and it's this guy. His name is Sir Walter Raleigh. You can see here on the right, he was a fancy guy. He's got the flowers in his hair and the lovely, what we know as the Elizabethan collar. It's a very highly starched lace collar. We'll look at Elizabethan fashion here momentarily. This is a famous story on the left where Raleigh, who had spent like his entire, let's say, allowance, whatever it was, on this beautiful, velvet cape. And the story is that Elizabeth came walking to the streets. There was a mud puddle. He laid the cape down on it so that she could walk on the cape and not get her feet muddy. And of course, she was very charmed by him. He was handsome. He was young. He had, shown this great regard for her by letting his, very expensive cape essentially be ruined at this point. Whether or not this story happened, probably not. But it is one of the great, stories told by English people to this day. All right. Because he had made friends with her, she gave him some opportunities in the New World. He said, look, I think we could not just explore there, not just find raw materials, but how about this? Let's start a colony there. All right, so we did. We call it, unfortunately, the Lost Colony. It happened right over here in a place called Roanoke Island. It was Raleigh who named the area Virginia after the Queen, okay? Because now she never got married. She was known as the Virgin Queen. And so Virginia, the United States of America, state of Virginia, is named after Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen. All right, a group of people headed to Roanoke. I will tell you this, Walter Raleigh wanted to go himself. The Queen would not allow it. She wanted him to stay with her at court in the parties and things like that. So he sent a group of people. We can see what's happening down here. The first English child born in the New World was called Virginia Dare. Quickly, we'll go through here. John White was the governor. He was the grandfather also of Virginia Dare. He sent back beautiful artwork about the people they met there who were very friendly, but he had to be called back to England for an important event. Well, he had to go get some stuff, some resupplies, and he couldn't come back. And he was gone for a good solid 2 years, and when they came back to find the colony, it had disappeared completely with only a cryptic Croatoan written on a tree. When you take American history, you'll read about that. All right, so what was happening back in England that kept White from getting back home was Philip. Philip II was at this point when Elizabeth never married him, and his ideas of becoming king of England were dashed. He planned an invasion of England to reclaim the country for himself. And we have 1588, a huge year in English history, when the Spanish fleet came to invade England. It's called the Spanish Armada. And it was literally unbeatable, the most impressive thing anybody had ever seen on the seas. And they're going to invade little tiny England. Here's Elizabeth coming down to the shore of southern England to encourage her troops, including Sir Francis Drake. There's this great speech she gives. We just don't have time to watch it. So here's Drake, Francis Drake, fighting in these battles of the Spanish Armada. Elizabeth called everybody home. Nobody could be out, and this is why White could not go back to the New World. And Drake sends his ship out to go fight against the Spaniards. We have these things called fire ships. When they would capture a Spanish ship, they would set it on fire and set it and to be, carried over to crash into some of the other Spanish ships. You can see the impressive ship here. Notice how tall this ship is. They were very large ships, the Spanish ships. Here are some battles. They are shooting cannonballs at one another from the ships, arrows, flaming arrows, things like this. The English ships were much smaller, very maneuverable. They could get in, shoot some volleys, and then get away. And the Spaniards were kind of stuck. And then nature played a role, or maybe what England said, God played a role here. And there were these massive storms that wrecked so many of those large Spanish ships at this time. So you can see they came in. It comes sailing in. There's a battle at each one of these star places right here. Okay, and they're going to end up coming around the top to come attack on this side. Not sure why. They were just facing so much fire in here. We can see those fire ships coming in. And then when they got to the top, do I have that map? Yeah, I do. Okay, so they come around here, and they had some storms to the north, and then these massive, massive storms over here on the western side of the islands. And look at this. Each one of these marks these ships that were wrecked by storm. And then finally, a few that survived left and went back to Spain. Okay, this was a massive victory for Elizabeth. Unbelievable. The whole world was stunned that Philip's fleet was just decimated by the little fledgling fleet and army of Elizabeth. So they decided to stay on the offensive. The English ships sailed down to Cadiz. What does that say? 1590, and they captured Cadiz, which was a huge Spanish port. So England is on the rise. Spain is on the decline. England is going to become the most prominent European country. Okay, a couple of other favorites. We have Devereux, Earl of Essex. We'll just call him Essex. And he was one of the favorites of the Queen until he lost favor. He was a great soldier. He ended up losing a few battles in the war in Ireland. And when he came to make his case to the Queen, he came rushing into her boudoir right here before she had been fully dressed. Look at her. She hadn't even got her wig put on. She was furious that he came into her room unannounced and seen her without her wig. And so she had him executed. He was no longer her favorite. He actually did lead a rebellion, and so she had to have him executed. And her new favorite became, yes, Sir Walter Raleigh. There he is with his beautiful collar. Let's look at some fashion really quickly. Lots of cake makeup here to make the white-looking face. That was really because Elizabeth was covering up her pox marks. And then we can see this fashion right here. Kind of really lovely, actually. Here we see some different versions of the fashion. In the men, we can see the doublet and the pantaloons and things like this. The hose, the stockings, something called a jerkin. This is one like you would see in a Shakespeare play. All right. Literature, we had Edmund Spenser writing The Faerie Queene, still read today. A lovely piece of work. Christopher Marlowe, a playwright. He wrote a play called of Dr. Faustus. And it's really about a guy who sells his soul to the devil in order to have knowledge. And Marlowe was an outstanding writer. We're going to see at one point he got involved in a bar brawl. He may have actually been in Walsingham's spy network, and he was doing some spying, but something happened to him. And one of those things in a bar brawl that he was in, he ended up dead with a knife in his eye. Like, boy, howdy, there we go. So the preeminent then dramatist would rise to the top would be William Shakespeare. We're familiar with this guy. And we're going to see his statistics right here when he lived and this kind of thing. He wrote the plays. Here's his signature here at the bottom. There is some debate whether he wrote the plays himself or other people helped him, quote unquote, or wrote it for him. Some people even claim that William Shakespeare was illiterate, couldn't write at all. I don't buy it. I think the plays that we hear from Shakespeare, which are brilliant, were indeed written by William Shakespeare. Some people accredit them to Christopher Marlowe. And of course, now he's dead at this point. We have the Globe Theatre. This is where many of the plays were put on. This is in London. And this to the right is a reconstruction because the actual one did burn down. Look at it. It's just, ripe for a fire. And those of us who came to the little play earlier this year when we saw Hamlet, they were trying to recreate it in a smaller degree at that little theater that we went to. So here we can see some of his plays. All right, by the numbers, we have comedies, histories, and tragedies. Longest plays here, Antony, Cleopatra, Othello, Hamlet. Shortest plays, the comedies, looks like, Richard III's one of the shortest. Interesting. Okay, because it's quite long, actually. Some of my favorites would be Julius Caesar, love it, love it. Macbeth so this would be a history. My favorite history, I think, is Julius Caesar. My favorite tragedy is Macbeth, that Scottish play. My favorite comedies, I have to toss up between Twelfth Night and Much Ado About Nothing. I like both of those. I love to watch any Shakespearean adaptation. We have several that are newer movies, right? Lion King is supposed to be an adaptation of Hamlet. That's interesting. The 10 Things I Hate About You. I don't know if you've heard of any of these. That one is about Kiss Me Kate, or what's it called? Taming of the Shrew. She's the Man, I believe, is Twelfth Night, a remake of Twelfth Night where the girl pretends to be her brother, like a twin. She's a twin with her brother, but she pretends to be her brother. We have, I think this is a Romeo and Juliet called Warm Bodies. I think it might have, what do you call that? The dead walking people. What are they called? Yeah, anyway, those guys. West Side Story, definitely a retelling of the Romeo and Juliet story, which is a tragedy. If you ever get a chance to go out to Winedale, just outside of Round Top, to the east of us a little bit, is the Shakespeare Festival in the summertime. It's a local resource. and students who are either UT students or come for the summer will put on plays. I went this past summer to see a play there. It was absolutely wonderful. You're actually in a barn. It's pretty warm, so you dress up accordingly because it's in the summer. This would have been a telling of Hamlet, but we saw Hamlet, and here is the, to be or not to be. That is the question. This is Mel Gibson, by the way, in the retelling of Hamlet. We're going to skip that, but because I want to talk about Francis Bacon really quick. He was a scientist of the time. Some people, he was a favorite of Elizabeth, and some people say, there are some people actually who say that Francis Bacon is her son. That's crazy, from either Devereux or Essex or one of these guys. I think that's probably just stories right there. He developed a scientific method, and he's very actually influential in the world of science. I have to kind of rush through this because we're at the end here, because I want to tell you this really great story about the haunted chicken. We're going to watch a little video, and we'll end with that today. Here we go.
London town was quiet and still. A blizzard blew on Highgate Hill. That winter in 1626, the village pond froze hard as bricks. Icicles dripped and snow did flutter as Sir Francis Bacon sat down to supper. A festive log was full ablaze, but the poultry had seen better days. In the butcher's window for a week, the chicken had become antique. A dismal offering on the plate, food well past its sell-by date. The meat was tough and far from tasty. His choice of bird had been too hasty, but Frank was clever and so well read. An idea popped into his head. As he stared at the falling snow, the inspiration began to flow. That dry old bird was poorly chosen, but surely chickens could be frozen. His concept heralding the future, he scurried downhill to the butcher. If he was right, he'd soon be shipping the world's first ever frozen chicken. A strange experiment loomed ahead. Frank roused the butcher from his bed. A deal was quickly done, but then who would be the unlucky hen? Fate's fickle finger came to rest on the poor bird with the plumpest breast. The chosen one was hard to catch. The butcher chased it with an axe. Around in circles they did run, the chicken's speed second to none. They dashed till they were fit to drop, but finally came the killer chop. A bloody sack beneath his cape, Frank's grisly plan was taking shape. A slippery Highgate Hill ascent, collecting snowballs as he went. And now the story becomes eerie. To demonstrate his brilliant theory, he packed the pullet full of snow in places you don't want to know. The victim, once alive and kicking, was now a very angry chicken, floating above with a deathly glow, the flesh and blood it used to know. A most undignified demise had passed before the spectre's eyes, and just as things could not get worse, it conjured up a dreadful curse. Collecting snowballs on his own left poor Frank frozen to the bone. So, deeply chilled from toe to head, he retired sickly to his bed. Sir Francis lethally infected, his idea legally unprotected, he headed for the pearly gates, as swift as if on roller skates. The hen had surely had revenge. but she missed her feathery friends and chose to take this lonely pill by forever haunting Highgate Hill. So to Highgate, present day. The chicken's ghost's not gone away. It haunts a place still called Pond Square, although the pond's no longer there. It runs in circles round and makes a quite ear-splitting sound, which leaves folks terrified and mad. That's all except one little lad. Young Tom loves this chicken run. He has a wicked sense of fun. He's great chums with the glowing phantom and goes out haunting with the bantam. The pair spend many happy days frightening Highgate's post-pub strays. Their curious friendship quickly thickens a solid bond of boy and chicken. But now true friendship has appeared, the bird has suddenly disappeared. Perhaps she now feels free to fly to that great hen house in the sky. Scaring grown-ups is huge fun. Tom misses his dead, feathered chum. But what is this? The chicken's rear has left a ghostly souvenir. We may all speculate and fathom if it is made from ectoplasm, but where the spook has sat and rested, it seems an egg has manifested. Finally comes a big surprise. A ghostly chick's materialised, the offspring, we can now reveal, of the world's first ever frozen meal. Might ghostly hens lay eggs as well? In this strange fable, who can tell? A most elaborate plot device, a present from a poultrygeist. Now second generation spooks appear in Highgate's history books, and ghostly chickens still parade. Excellent for the tourist trade.
All right, so you get the gist there. I don't know about that last part about the boy and the egg and all that business, but the part about Sir Francis Bacon catching a chicken and putting it in the snow and freezing it, it did lead to the idea of frozen food. That's good. He did catch a cold and he did die. So that part's true. And so then the idea of the chicken haunting the area is also true. Okay, so a fun story to end our day there. Sorry I went over just a tad. I do need you to keep up with your homework and all that. And I will see you next week. Everybody stay warm. So long.